Wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away. Wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today. Calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, ye from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. 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 Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love. For all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us. With those who've gone on before us. Singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love.
So we are in the portion of Luke's gospel where he's dealing with Jesus' Galilean ministry. It starts around chapter 1 and verse 16, goes through chapter 3 and verse 12 or so, and then it'll move to the next phase of this section of the gospel. We're getting obviously toward the end of his record of the work in and around Galilee, and now we have activity going on the Sabbath and an interaction with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes, the leaders of the Jewish faith at the time. We have seen over the last couple of weeks that what they're doing is they're basically following him around and looking for opportunities to make accusation. And he is answering them. And then there's something else that's going on. Jesus is doing these things and setting them up, giving himself opportunities to teach specific things about himself and his authority, his power to forgive sins and those kinds of things, his power over leprosy, and all of that is being displayed. And so it says, starting in verse 23 of chapter 2, it came about that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "See here." Now there's one of the clues that they're out there looking for things to accuse him of. Oh, we got you this time. "See here, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now, the accusation essentially is that the disciples, Jesus is apparently not out there picking. So it's not why, it's why are you as their rabbi allowing them to do this? And so it comes back on Jesus because he's the leader. And they're making this accusation. They're picking these heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "It's not lawful to do this on the Sabbath." And then he responds. And I'm going to be honest with you, this is some of the most difficult stuff to deal with in terms of the way he responds and what it means and what we're to learn from it that is in this gospel. There's several things about the Sabbath that I think are worth noting before we start talking about Jesus' response. And so drop your ribbon marker right here. We'll be back in just a few minutes. But let's go to the book of Exodus for a moment. There's a series of passages in Exodus that have to do with the Jewish law regarding the Sabbath. And quite frankly, one of the things that we're going to see is there's not a whole lot of guidance or information, at least not that's recorded. How much more teaching that Moses did about the application of this, I don't know, but the language is pretty broad. And so starting in chapter 20, and we could go back to chapter 16, which is and I guess it's in Numbers 16, the manna incident, and they're not allowed to go out and gather manna on the Sabbath. I'm going to just assume that everybody in the room is familiar with that, and concentrate on the law as it was given. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, or you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or your sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. And so the general prohibition against doing work. Okay, so what is work? That's what the question has to be. What behavior crosses the threshold between work or not work? I mean, does getting up out of bed, is that work? Putting on your clothes, taking a shower. Obviously, I'm modernizing the examples. Yes, sir.
Well, as the Jews of today understand it, they even limit the amount of distance that they can walk to go to work.
Well, they did a lot of rule making based on the things that we're going to read. And they did try to define the parameters and say, okay, this is not work, but if you do this, is where it's... But I want you to understand, anytime you draw lines like that, so 57 steps is not work, but the 58th step, that's work. I mean, that's the kinds of thing that you're dealing with. And that's where this arises. That's part of the problem. That's the accusation they're making against them, is they're doing work. In order for it to be unlawful on the Sabbath, we're going to have to classify this as work, what they're doing, okay? Turn over to chapter 31, the same book of Exodus, and we'll read, starting in verse 12, another little dissertation about the Sabbath. The Lord said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you." And so there's some more context being laid as to what the Jews are supposed to gain from observing the Sabbath. But not a whole lot of context yet in this text about what the Sabbath or keeping the Sabbath consists of. "You shall keep the Sabbath because it's holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death." Okay, so there's a serious penalty for profaning the Sabbath. But what profanes the Sabbath? Well, doing work on the Sabbath profanes the Sabbath. But again, we're at our problem of what is work. "Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It's a sign forever between me and the people of Israel." I'm going to stop right there. Side note, just for the value of those people who insist that we today should keep the Sabbath. Notice that this was between Israel and God. This was not between anybody else and God. It didn't apply to anybody else and God. It only applied to them under that covenant. So unless you're living under the covenant given to Israel, you don't have this prohibition. "It's a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. He gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on the Mount of Sinai, the 2 tablets of testimony, tablets of stone." And so we're not given any more definition or outline or parameters about what constitutes work on the Sabbath and what doesn't. But if you do profane the Sabbath, we are told what the penalty is. Death, not pleasant. All right, go over to chapter 35. And we'll pick up the reading in chapter 35, just verses 2 and 3. 6 days work shall be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in all your dwelling places on the Sabbath day. There you go. You want an activity, that's the only one I'm given. And I don't really think it's so much about the kindling the fire as much as that's a part standing for the whole. Why would you kindle the fire in your dwelling place? To bake and to cook and to do all the things that you have to do to work. That is where the Sabbath, as it was observed in the wilderness, does kind of come into play. You gather for 6 weeks. On the seventh day, you're not to gather anything. You're to prepare your cakes and do all that ahead of time and then eat on the Sabbath. Was eating on the Sabbath okay? Yeah, but you weren't allowed to work. You were allowed to maintain eating and living and dressing and doing the normal things that you would do. What's really the focus of all this? Okay. An idea of holiness and of it being a focus on God on that day. Okay, so let's go to Leviticus 19:30 for just a moment. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. There you go. Now, again, I don't know how much instruction beyond this that Moses was given and that he instructed Aaron and the priests to give to the people. I don't know how much more, because we don't have all the record of everything that was done and said. We have what is necessary for us. But I do want to read this to you. This is from a website that is run by Jewish religious people. It's called theisraelbible.com. You can go there. There's lots of information there about what they do and how they practice. And there's a whole page dedicated to the 39 forbidden acts of the Sabbath. And what they basically did, the rabbis over the years classified 39 different categories of work. And then the debate rages about what qualifies as the category. So you were not allowed to harvest or reap during the Sabbath. So the question is, does plucking grain qualify as harvesting? And they determined yes. Yes, it does. But this is what they say at the end of this assessment. When human life is endangered, a Jew is not only allowed but required to violate any Sabbath law that stands in the way of saving that person. The concept of life being in danger is interpreted broadly. For example, it is a mandated one that's an important phrase. It's interpreted broadly. It's described being in danger. It is mandated that one violate the Sabbath to take a woman in active labor to the hospital. That's the example they give. Are they in danger? Well, by their assessment, yes. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the Pharisees who have come to him with their interpretation of what it means to work on the Sabbath. And the accusation that plucking grain on the Sabbath qualifies as work. All right, there's another Old Testament passage that I want to reference. It's the book of Isaiah. And we're going to spend a teeny bit of time here in Isaiah in chapter 58. And I'm going to preface what we're about to read simply by saying this whole part of Isaiah is really looking forward to Christ and the church, and that started already in the shift, pointing people toward Jesus, pointing people toward the church, pointing people toward what God has in store. In this chapter, if you have headings, might be titled in your Bible, True and False Fasting, or something along that line. There is a long discussion about fasting and what they were supposed to do and all that kind of stuff. He's describing really the intent is what he's doing here. So he says, cry aloud, do not hold back, lift up your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their transgression, the house of Jacob their sins. You seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation and that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgment of God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted and you not seen it? That's the question. Okay, so they pretend like they're interested in knowing what God has commanded and they want to have a relationship with God. And then they ask this question, why have we fasted and you not seen it? Okay, what's wrong with fasting or our fasting? Why are you not recognizing that we're keeping the commandment? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure. You hear that? He says, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure. You're not trying to please me. You're seeking to satisfy yourselves and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and fight and to hit with wicked fists. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice be heard on high. So they were missing the intent and purpose of fasting. Now, in connection with that, let's roll down, and so we don't read the entire chapter, although we probably should. I may have to because I may not be able to find where it makes the switch. Let's just start in verse 6. Nope, that's definitely... Well, let's just start in verse 6. Is this not the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of the wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor to your house when you see the naked to cover him and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry, and he will save you. Here I am. So he's saying what? When you practice fasting for the right reasons, and it accomplishes and changes you the way that it's supposed to. In other words, you use it and you share what you're not eating with the homeless and the hungry, and you invite them in and you care for them, and you do the purpose of what fasting was all about. Then I'll hear you. You take away the yoke from your midst, pointing the finger and speaking wickedness. You pour yourself out for the hungry. Satisfy the desire of the afflicted. You shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. This is verse 11 I'm at. And the Lord will guide you continually. Satisfy your desire in scorched places. Make your bones strong, and you'll be like watered garden, like a spring of water, those whose waters do not fail. And your ancient ruin shall be rebuilt. You shall rise up. The foundations of many generations shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to dwell in. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath. So now he makes a switch. He's not talking about fasting. He's using now the Sabbath, basically making the same point. Turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day. The Sabbath was about what? It was about God. It was about pleasing God. It was not about... It wasn't about rest for their bodies. I hear people talk about that all the time. Oh, God prescribed a day of rest because they needed rest. That's not why he prescribed it. It wasn't for their pleasure. It was to give an entire day of focus to God and what God had done for them. To remember the God of creation. To remember the God of deliverance out of Egyptian bondage. To remember all those things that he had attached to fasting. If you turn back, if you quit observing the Sabbath for your pleasure on my holy day and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, are seeking your own pleasure, are talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I'll make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob, your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. He gets to the core of what the Sabbath commandment was about, and he said, if you really want to please me, then respect the purpose of the Sabbath. And that is not at all what these people are doing with Jesus. They're actually using the Sabbath for their pleasure. What was their pleasure at the time? To accuse Jesus. They're using it. They're not learning from it. And that is important to the way that Jesus answers them in understanding this. He said to them, we're back in Mark 2 now, verse 25, have you never read what David did when he was in need and became hungry? He and his companions, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he gave it also to those who were with him. I'm not going to take the time to read that whole story, nor am I going to take the time to go back and reference all of the description of the law that was given about it, but I want to just give you the synopsis. This is what happened. Okay, they made bread, 12 loaves of bread, and they put them out on a table in the holy place. It was one of the things in the first chamber of the temple. Okay, every Sabbath, that bread was taken off and fresh bread was put in place. And that bread that was removed was given to the priests to use as their bread. David was not a priest. But what we can, and by the way, the record in 1 Samuel doesn't tell us that it was a Sabbath day, but because the bread was available tells us that it was the Sabbath day. And so Jesus using this as an example is because David did this on the Sabbath. And what do these stories have in common? Well, David and his people were hungry and they needed bread. David goes in, says, we need something to eat. It's the Sabbath day. We can't work, can't do anything. We can't transact. And he says, all I got is showbread. And only the priest can have that. But if you can promise me that you've kept yourself from women and that you are consecrated and holy, I'll let you have some. And so it was given to him and his men, despite the fact that they were not priests. Now, the suggestion is that the fact that they were in need, that they were hungry, that they had to eat, that superseded. That mattered. And that allowed them to have access to this bread, despite the fact that, generally speaking, it was not. And keeping that commandment, by the way, of the showbread and the whole thing that they did, that didn't have anything to do with anything other than learning and understanding their relationship with God better, just like the Sabbath. All these things happening on the Sabbath. By the way, none of these men condemned David. And that's actually the point that Jesus is making. You understand how this works. So listen to what he goes on and says. He was saying to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. He's saying essentially in that very succinct statement what Isaiah said in the 58th chapter of Isaiah. It's not just the perfunctory keeping of the day. It's not the not working because you don't really want to work. It's the honoring God and understanding the relationship of God and understanding the purpose. And if part of the reason is to understand, then what they should have also understood is that gleaning, which is what they were doing, was not harvesting. What he had was hungry disciples who were passing by on the road, and we've talked about this a couple of times in lessons recently. The Jews were instructed when they harvested their fields to leave the edges. And those edges were left for the people who were poor, who were displaced, who didn't have homes, who didn't have food, who were hungry, to be able to glean. Was plucking the head of grain, was that work? Well, in another place in the Old Testament, there's a distinction actually made that says, look, when you glean, you can pluck the heads, but you can't put your sickle to the field. So in other words, I can get enough for me to eat, but I can't harvest. You can go into the vineyards and you can eat you can eat your fill, but you know what you can't do? Cart it out. So what Jesus' point is here is this is no different. What we're doing is not breaking the Sabbath. What we're doing is honoring the purpose of these laws. Consequently, he says, verse 28, this is actually what's being taught here. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So what was he actually teaching them? Now you got to picture the whole thing. Here are these people. These are the scribes and the Pharisees, the people who fancy themselves to be the ones who know everything that there is to know about the law, to have all the answers. They're the ones who wrote down all the rules, the 39 things that you can't do on the Sabbath. They're also the ones that sat down and said, okay, what constitutes this? Well, this constitutes and this constitutes, and they make all these rules, and they come to him saying, why are you letting your disciples break the Sabbath? And he says, I gave the Sabbath. Don't you think I know what keeping the Sabbath looks like? The reason this whole scenario plays out, the reason why the Lord let his disciples do this on the Sabbath, was to create this scenario where he could teach these people what? I'm the Lord. Just like he taught them that he could forgive sins when he healed a lame man. And he did that by saying, your sins are forgiven. And then they get all out of whack because he said your sins are forgiven and only God can forgive sins. And he said what? Which is easier? Is it easier to say your sins are forgiven or rise and walk? Okay, here, rise and walk. There. Now, so you know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. Same thing going on here. This whole scenario laid out by Christ, set up by Christ, so that when they come and charge him on the Sabbath, he basically says to them, I'm the one who gave the Sabbath. So he's telling them what? I'm God. You're going to come to God and define for God what his law prohibits. Is that really what you're going to do? Very rough illustration, but I'll use it anyway because it's so good. I used to work for a man named John Cash Smith. He was an attorney, and he was an early purchaser of land around the reservoirs when they were built over there between Texas and Louisiana. I don't remember if it was on Toledo or if it was on Rayburn, but it was on one of those two reservoirs. He had a bunch of land, and he actually was the one who wrote all the deed restrictions that were applied to these tracts of land. And then years later, somebody complained about his use of the property that he owned and said, it's against the deed restrictions. And his reply was, I wrote the deed restrictions. I know what they say, and I know what... You can't lecture me about the use of the land because I'm the one who described how it could be used. That's essentially what Jesus is doing here. You're going to come to me and lecture to me about how to keep the Sabbath when I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. And I'm telling you, the Sabbath was given to man for man's benefit. It wasn't given for man to use to hurt one another. And so that's at least where I stand today about how this all plays out. Now, if you're going to ask me the question whether David was technically breaking the law when he took the showbread and ate it, I'm going to tell you I don't know. I still wrestle with that question. I know what it says. I know this. This isn't saying that we can pick or choose what laws to obey. That's not what this is saying. This is saying that God knows how it applies better than we do. And so we need to listen to him rather than come instructing him. Basically the same thing Habakkuk said, right? The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Now that's not telling us not to say anything, because he actually instructs us to pray and to sing and to do all. What's he mean when he says let the earth keep silence before him? It means respect his authority. Listen to him rather than tell him. Isn't that the same thing that the Lord told Job? After Job exhausted himself, then the Lord finally spoke and said, what? Who is this that darkens counsel without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me. Tell me how it was done. By the way, nobody can tell anybody how it was done, because the only record we have of it says what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. How was it done? God created them. That's all we know. And so that question is actually posed to Job so that Job understands what? I don't know anything unless God tells me. So maybe rather than leveling my thoughts about such things, I should be quiet and listen and see what God says about such things. And so Jesus is here asserting once again his authority over religion and the practice of religion. And by the way, that started in the 2 verses prior to this incident with the patch of unshrunk cloth on a new wineskin thing. I have authority over this. I know when it's time to change something and what time was coming up. The time to change. You'll recall when he taught on the Mount, we call it the Sermon on the Mount, he repeatedly said, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And that was him asserting his authority and his right to command. And that's what he's doing here. So that's generally what I understand about this. Anybody have any questions or comments before we move on? Got about 5 minutes left. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. We might be able to get a few of these things. We might even be able to get all the way to verse 12. Who knows? He entered again into the synagogue. This is chapter 3. And so this isn't immediately. When it's immediately, Mark has used the word immediately. This is yet again a thing that he's done before. Jesus has gone into the synagogues. He does this again. And a man was there with a withered hand, and they were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. So this is another Sabbath, in order that they might accuse him. Notice they're watching in order that they might accuse. They're still doing it. He said to the man with the withered hand, rise and come forward. And he said to him, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill it? Now, this sounds an awful lot like Isaiah's chapter about these things, right? They kept silent. So what Jesus does is he knows what's going on. He knows what they're doing. And so he calls the man with the withered hand to him, and the guy gets up and walks over to him. And then he turns to all these people who are seeking to accuse him, and he says, well, tell me, before I go any further, is it okay for me to help this guy on the Sabbath? Is it okay to do harm or to save? Which is the right thing to do on the Sabbath? After looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. You know why they were hard? I mean, what they had done to demonstrate their hardness of heart? They had not answered. They kept silent. By the way, after looking around at them with anger, did Jesus get mad? Yeah. Is it a sin to get mad? No. Be angry and sin not. There is righteous anger. There are times when it's proper to be angry. What you need to do is to do what? Retain your control and not do anything that is sinful. Notice also that his anger is accompanied with what? Grief. He grieved. He said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately began taking counsel with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. Why didn't they accuse him publicly at this point like they had every other time? Yeah, he had put them in a box too. He had put them in a box by giving them the opportunity to answer the question whether it was lawful. Then he did it. Now, the man's hand was restored, so who was going to believe that God wasn't with him? They couldn't make an accusation at this point. They had foregone the opportunity to stop it from happening, but they want to destroy him. That's what they want. That's what they wanted all along. Because if they can accuse him of breaking the Sabbath, what is the appropriate response to someone who is proven to have broken the Sabbath? Death. That's what they're trying to bring about. That's why they're concentrating on the Sabbath part of it. Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and also from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, in the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. A great multitude heard of all that he was doing and came to him, and he told his disciples that a boat should stand ready for him because of the multitude, in order that they might not crowd him. For he had healed many, with the result that all those who had afflictions pressed about him in order to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits beheld him, they would fall down before him and cry out, saying, you are the Son of God. I'm going to stop right there and just make this observation. I probably should read verse 12, but I'm not going to. Why is it that demons will respond to Jesus appropriately and men refuse? This is set counter to these Pharisees who have sat down with the Herodians and are determining a way to destroy Jesus. Their response to Jesus is to destroy him. And the demons' response to Jesus is to throw themselves at his feet and declare him to be the Son of God. So when I refuse Jesus, may I be keenly aware that I'm behaving more poorly than an evil spirit. I'm being more rebellious than an evil spirit. He earnestly warned them not to make him known. It was not yet time. We've talked about that previously. He didn't want for things to happen outside of his control. He wanted them to happen at the appropriate time. All right. For benefits of your study moving forward, the next section, starting in chapter 3 and verse 13, goes through chapter 6 and verse 6. This is kind of the climax of his ministry. And so write those verses down somewhere, make a mental note of them, make a note on your phone, whatever. That's what you need to be reading and studying in preparation for our discussions moving forward over the next couple of weeks. Anybody have any questions or comments before we wrap this up? All right, my 38-minute timer just went off, so I'm going to stop unless there is someone that has a question. All right.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory.